The scream came first, raw and unrecognizable, before anyone realized it was hers. Acid hissed against her skin like fire-devouring paper, the smell of burning flesh spreading faster than fear itself. And in that single cruel instant, the city seemed to hold its breath, as if stunned by the audacity of hatred laid bare in broad daylight. Maya Johnson had never believed she would die on a sidewalk surrounded by neighbors who suddenly became statues, their eyes frozen wide, unsure if they were witnessing a crime or a nightmare too savage to name. She was 16, her backpack still stuffed with math homework and a half-eaten granola bar, but now her body was a battlefield scorched by racism, her childhood dissolved in seconds. By the time the police sirens wailed, it was already too late. Irony dripped thicker than the acid searing her skin. The very men sworn to protect had become her executioners. Not out of mistake, not out of panic, out of choice. They saw a black girl walking home, headphones in her ears, her laughter echoing down cracked pavement. And in their eyes, that was enough. Enough to mock, to corner, to silence, to erase. The moment the acid bottle cracked open, Maya saw it in their smirks. This was never about law and order. This was about reminding her that her skin, to them, was both a crime and a sentence. The hospital lights blurred into streaks of gold as morphine tugged at her consciousness, but pain anchored her to every second. Doctors spoke in urgent whispers, the word survival, repeated like a coin tossed into a fountain where hope had long dried up. Her mother's voice was the only thing that tethered her to life. Judge Evelyn Johnson, who had faced down senators, governors, and even presidents with a steady gaze, now trembled as she whispered her daughter's name. Yet behind those tears was steel, a promise more unbreakable than any oath she had ever sworn in court. They will pay. Maya's world shrank into sterile walls, her face hidden beneath layers of gauze, her reflection erased by bandages and burns. But her mind replayed the attack in ruthless clarity. The laughter of the officers, the sound of liquid splashing, the heat that clawed into her skin like 1,000 knives. And worst of all, the silence of witnesses' eyes that looked away because pain not their own was easier to ignore. Rage became her oxygen. She would not let her story become another file buried under the weight of incidents no one dared to name as racist crimes. Evelyn carried that same rage, though hers was tempered by years of navigating the labyrinth of American justice. She knew the system was built to protect men like them. Reports would be lost. Evidence would go missing. Statements would be twisted until truth bled dry. But Evelyn had risen higher than anyone ever believed a black woman could. Her robe and gavel symbols not just of authority, but of survival. She had fought her way onto the Supreme Court bench, and now, fate had placed before her not just a case, but a reckoning. The city buzzed with half-truths and whispers. News stations painted Maya as a troubled teen before backtracking under public outrage. Commentators debated whether too much was being made of race, even as images of her blistered skin circulated online. Protesters filled the streets, their chants echoing into the night. Justice for Maya. Graffiti blazed across abandoned walls. Her life matters. Yet beneath the noise, fear simmered, fear that the men who did this would walk free, shielded by badges polished brighter than their sins. Maya refused to be invisible. Against her doctor's advice, she demanded to testify. "They need to see me," she rasped through a throat scarred by both acid and courage. Not just the scars. Me. Her words struck Evelyn like lightning. Her daughter was not just fighting for survival, she was fighting to reclaim her humanity in a world that tried to strip it away. And Evelyn knew then that justice could no longer be delayed. The federal trial unfolded like a stage set for truth and betrayal alike. The officers, once smug, now sat in suits, their lawyers painting them as misunderstood public servants. They claimed Maya provoked them, that it was a tragic accident, that perhaps the bottle wasn't even theirs. Lies dripped smoother than the acid they had hurled, but Evelyn had seen every trick before. She sat higher than them, robed in black, her face carved from resolve. Yet inside, the mother in her screamed louder than the judge. The gallery held its breath each time Maya entered. Bandages still wrapped her, but her presence burned brighter than any wound. She spoke, her voice quivering yet unbroken, recounting every second of the attack with brutal honesty. No theatrics, no embellishments, only truth raw enough to sear through any lie. The courtroom, accustomed to polished words and rehearsed testimonies, now sat drenched in silence heavy with shame. Even the officers shifted in their seats, their bravado crumbling under the weight of a teenager's courage. Evelyn's gavel echoed like thunder when she called order, but in her heart, she was holding more than a trial. She was holding history. Every verdict before had led to this moment. Every injustice endured by generations now demanded to be answered. The law, so often twisted against people like her daughter, would bend today toward justice, not away from it. And as the golden sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, Evelyn felt it not just as a judge, not just as a mother, but as a black woman who had carried centuries of silence on her shoulders. The time had come. Underneath the weight of cameras and whispered speculation, the trial grew into something far larger than a case about a single girl. It became a mirror. America was forced to look at itself, and many did not like what they saw. Reporters dissected every detail: Maya's school grades, her friendships, even the color of her nail polish the day she was at a kid, as though any of it could justify what had been done to her. Comment sections spilled venom. Some declared she was lying. Others insisted the officers were framed. But in the crowded courtroom, the truth sat breathing, raw and undeniable, wrapped in gauze and courage. Evelyn had expected resistance, but the brutality of it still startled her. Defense attorneys painted elaborate fantasies. The acid had been planted. Maya had somehow attacked herself. The witnesses who had come forward were confused or seeking attention. Each lie stacked higher than the last until the air in the room was thick with deceit. Yet every time Evelyn looked at her daughter sitting just a few feet away, she remembered why she had fought so long to sit in that chair, wielding authority most thought impossible for a black woman to possess. She had not clawed her way through decades of prejudice to let men like these twist the world upside down. Maya herself became a beacon in the proceedings. She did not cower when the lawyers tried to break her down on the stand. Her voice cracked, but did not vanish. When they accused her of misinterpreting events, she looked them in the eye and said, "Pain does not lie." Those 4 words landed with the force of a verdict long before the trial was over. People in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, as though ashamed of ever doubting her. The stenographer's hands trembled slightly, knowing she was recording history. Outside the courthouse, marches continued. Thousands carried candles at night, golden flames flickering against the dark sky, chanting her name not as a victim, but as a symbol. For every voice that tried to diminish her, 100 rose to defend her. Churches rang bells in solidarity, schools held walkouts, and social media surged with images of Maya's bandaged face alongside words like courage, justice, and hope. Yet with each act of solidarity, threats multiplied. Evelyn received anonymous letters warning her to step down. Protesters outside her home shouted accusations of bias, calling her unfit to preside. Security doubled, but the fear seeped into the walls of her house like smoke. At night, Evelyn watched her daughter sleep. Maya's face was still a battlefield, but there was a serenity there, as though even pain had grown tired of tormenting her. Evelyn's own reflection in the window was harder to bear. She saw not a judge or even a mother, but a soldier standing in a war she had not chosen. Yet she reminded herself, wars are rarely chosen. They are survived, and sometimes they are won. The turning point came when the prosecution unveiled video footage that had surfaced from a nearby store camera. Grainy but clear enough, it captured the officers laughing before the attack, one of them holding the bottle like a weapon meant for a battlefield. The defense scrambled, claiming the footage was taken out of context, but the room had already shifted. Gasps filled the air, tears slid down strangers' cheeks, and for the first time, Evelyn allowed herself to believe that the tide was turning. But hope is never linear. The next day, one of the jurors was caught posting online about the case, forcing a delay and reopening old wounds of doubt. News pundits feasted on the setback, some declaring it proof that the case was too emotionally charged to be fair. Evelyn kept her composure, but inside she seethed at the hypocrisy. Justice for Black lives was always too emotional, always too complicated, Always something to be postponed until silence buried it again. Not this time. Maya's health wavered as the stress mounted. The hospital visits became more frequent. The burns fought to heal, but left her vulnerable to infections. On one particularly dark evening, she clutched her mother's hand and whispered, "What if they walk free?" Evelyn froze, the question slicing deeper than any wound. She wanted to promise victory, to erase the fear from her daughter's eyes. But she had sworn her life to truth, and truth could not be bent, even by a mother's love. So instead she said, "Then we fight again. And again. Until one day, someone like you won't have to ask that question." When closing arguments arrived, the courtroom transformed into a battlefield of words. The defense leaned into theatrics, voices rising, hands gesturing wildly, spinning tales of mistaken identity, overreaction, and regrettable accidents. They painted the officers as men under pressure, victims of a media frenzy, pleading for sympathy. But when the prosecution rose, silence fell like a curtain. They spoke not with theatrics, but with fire sharpened into precision. They replayed Maya's testimony, the footage, the medical reports, the eyewitness accounts. And then they ended with a single sentence that hung in the air long after the words were spoken. "If this is not justice denied, then what is?" Evelyn's gavel struck, signaling the end of arguments, but her heart thundered louder than the wood against the bench. She knew the verdict was not in her hands, not yet. It belonged to the jury, 12 ordinary citizens carrying the weight of centuries. As they filed out to deliberate, the air in the room was thick with a tension that pressed into every lung, every heartbeat. Hours stretched into eternity. Outside, protesters held their breath, candles flickering in the cool night air, waiting for a decision that could either ignite hope or confirm despair. Inside, Maya sat with her mother in a private chamber, her hand trembling in Evelyn's. "I'm not scared anymore," Maya said softly, surprising them both. "Whatever they say, I'm still here." They didn't win. Evelyn turned to her daughter, her vision blurring with tears she had refused to shed in public. "No, baby. They never will." When the jury returned, the entire building seemed to lean forward. Faces flushed with anticipation, breaths caught midair, silence roaring louder than thunder. The four-person stood, papers trembling in hand, eyes darting nervously. Evelyn steadied herself, her robe heavy not with fabric, but with the weight of history. On the charge of assault with intent to kill, the four-person began. "We find the defendants," the four-person's voice cracked under the gravity of the moment. "We find the defendants guilty." The words struck the air like a lightning bolt, tearing through the silence, igniting gasps, sobs, and even a few muffled cries of relief. Maya's hand clenched tighter in her mother's, trembling not from fear now, but from release. For the first time since acid burned her skin, she felt the burn of something else: vindication. Yet Evelyn did not move, her face carved into stone. A judge could not weep on the bench, not even when the tears threatened to break through like a flood. Her gavel came down with a finality that reverberated beyond the courtroom walls, echoing through television screens, radios, and phones across the nation. The guilty verdict was more than justice for Maya. It was a fracture in a wall built by centuries of lies, a reminder that even in a system designed to suffocate truth, light could still bleed through. But victory was not without shadows. Outside, as crowds erupted in chants of triumph, others screamed in rage. Protesters clashed, fists flying, flags burning, the night splitting between joy and fury. Commentators filled the airwaves, some calling the verdict a landmark of justice, others sneering that it was mob-driven bias. Evelyn watched from her chambers as the city seemed to convulse, a body both healed and wounded at once. She knew this verdict would not silence hatred, it would sharpen it. Still, hatred had been dragged into the open, exposed for all to see. That mattered. Maya returned to the hospital under tighter security, but this time she carried with her not just bandages, but the power of a verdict. Doctors said healing would be slow, scars permanent, but Maya smiled faintly. Permanent means I'll never forget, and neither will they. Her voice was quiet but steady, carrying a weight that startled even the nurses. She had become more than a survivor. She was a symbol, though she never asked to be. Evelyn faced a storm of consequences. Politicians demanded her resignation, accusing her of bias. Anonymous threats escalated, some promising to finish what the officers started. But Evelyn refused to bend. She stood before the press one evening, her robe catching the glow of camera lights, and declared, "Justice does not ask for permission. It demands to be seen," and today it was. Her voice did not shake. The image of her standing tall, her daughter's courage reflected in her own, traveled the world. Still, the verdict was only a beginning. Appeals were filed immediately. Talk of overturning the conviction slithered through the corridors of power. The system, relentless in its hunger to protect itself, was not done. Evelyn knew it would take every ounce of her strength to defend what had been won. She also knew Maya would never be the same girl she once was. Innocence had been ripped away, leaving in its place a steel resilience that no acid could corrode. One evening, as golden sunset light spilled into Maya's hospital room, she asked her mother a question that cut deeper than any cross-examination. Why do they hate us so much? Evelyn hesitated, searching for words that could cradle truth without crushing hope. Because we are proof of their fear, she finally said. Fear that we are stronger than the chains they tried to bind us with. Fear that we belong, no matter how much they deny it. Maya nodded slowly, her scarred face illuminated by the soft amber glow. Then let them be afraid. The media frenzy did not fade. Documentaries began filming, books were proposed, leaders visited her bedside. Maya, once a girl lost in the crowd of her high school hallway, was now the face of a movement. Yet fame carried a loneliness sharper than any knife. Friends drifted away, unable to meet her gaze without seeing the scars. Strangers stopped her in public, some offering love, others spitting hate. She learned quickly that surviving the attack was only the first battle. Living beyond it was the war. Evelyn, too, felt the weight of expectation. Activists called her a hero, but she knew better. Heroes win wars. She was only fighting to hold ground already drenched in blood. Each time she stepped onto the bench, she carried with her the knowledge that justice, though written in books and carved into marble, was still fragile, still breakable. But she also carried Maya's voice echoing in her memory. Pain does not lie. It became Evelyn's mantra, a truth she wielded like a weapon. The officers, now convicted, sat behind bars awaiting sentencing. They appealed, their lawyers screaming about political theater and biased judgment. But their words no longer carried weight. Their faces, once shielded by uniforms, were now symbols of disgrace. Maya watched their images on the news and felt no triumph, only a hollow ache. They thought they could erase me, she whispered. But now, it's them who are erased. The sentencing day arrived with a heat that pressed against the city like a fever. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, golden banners waving, chants echoing off stone walls. Inside, tension coiled around every seat, every breath. Evelyn entered the courtroom, her robe sweeping across the floor, her face unreadable. The defendants stood, their eyes darting, their hands clenched. Maya sat nearby, her scars uncovered, her presence a silent testimony stronger than any word. Evelyn's voice carried no tremor as she delivered the sentence. You used the power entrusted to you not to protect, but to destroy. You sought not justice, but cruelty. And for that, you will bear the full weight of this law you thought was yours to twist. She named their years decades that would stretch long enough for them to feel the cold walls of accountability pressing in. Gasps, sobs, cheers filled the room. For some, it was too harsh. For others, not harsh enough. But for Maya, it was enough to finally exhale. When mother and daughter stepped outside, the golden sunlight bathed them in warmth. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, protesters chanted. But for a moment, none of it mattered. Maya turned to her mother and whispered, "We did it." Evelyn squeezed her hand, her eyes glistening. "No, baby, you did it." That night, in the quiet of their home, Evelyn allowed herself to weep for the first time. Not for loss, not for fear, but for the unbroken thread of resilience that bound her and her daughter to something larger than themselves. Maya, scarred yet unbowed, walked to the window and looked out at the city, its streets glowing beneath the golden haze of streetlights. "They tried to burn me away," she murmured, "but all they did was light a fire." And Evelyn, standing behind her, knew she was right. The months after the sentencing unfolded like an uncharted landscape, equal parts promise and peril. For every headline celebrating the guilty verdict, there came another that warned of backlash. Some communities held vigils for Maya, praising her courage, while others staged angry rallies defending the disgraced officers, insisting they were scapegoats of political pressure. America was split down the middle, staring at its own reflection and refusing to agree on what it saw. Maya returned to school under the shadow of cameras. Her uniform fit differently now, stitched carefully to cover fragile skin, yet she walked the halls with her chin lifted. Some classmates looked away in guilt, others stared too long, but Maya refused to shrink. If I can face acid, she told herself, I can face their eyes. The first time she stood in front of her class to present a history project, the room fell silent not out of pity, but out of awe. She spoke with a clarity that silenced even the cruelest whispers. Her scars no longer defined her. Her voice did. Evelyn, meanwhile, found her days pulled in two directions. On the bench, she remained steady, presiding over cases with the same firmness as always. But outside the courtroom, she became a reluctant icon. Invitations poured in for speeches, conferences, interviews. She accepted some, declined many, but she never stopped reminding the world that Maya was not a symbol to be consumed. She was a child who had nearly lost everything. Still, Evelyn recognized the power in symbols. She saw young black girls approaching Maya in public, their eyes wide with admiration. You make me feel strong, one whispered. That mattered. But strength carried a price. Hate letters arrived daily, some crude, others chillingly detailed. One night, Evelyn found a brick thrown through her window, the glass glittering like cruel stars across the floor. Police promised protection, but Evelyn understood the truth. Justice always draws blood from those who fear it. She tightened security, but she did not retreat. She had faced senators who doubted her, colleagues who dismissed her, strangers who spat on her. She would not let cowards with bricks undo what courage had built. Maya's healing was slow. Surgeries, grafts, endless routines of pain and recovery filled her calendar. Yet each time she emerged from the operating room, she greeted her reflection with defiance. She began journaling, filling notebooks with raw words, rage, grief, hope. Her mother read one entry late at night, the words trembling on the page. My skin is burned, but I am not ash. I am fire. Evelyn closed the notebook with tears in her eyes, realizing her daughter's voice had already outgrown the courtroom. When the one-year anniversary of the attack arrived, the city braced itself. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse where it all began. Banners soared, candles flickered, and chants rose into the golden dusk. Justice lives here. Maya stepped onto the stage, her bandages long gone, scars gleaming under the lights. She gripped the microphone with steady hands and spoke. Her words were not rehearsed. They poured out like a river breaking its banks. She spoke of pain, but also of survival. She spoke of hatred, but also of love. She ended with a truth so simple it cut deeper than any speech before. They tried to silence me. Instead, they gave me a voice louder than theirs will ever be. The crowd roared, but Evelyn's eyes never left her daughter. She saw not just a survivor, not just her child, but the embodiment of resilience that generations before them had carried in silence. Now, that silence was shattered. Change was not immediate, but seeds had been planted. Legislation was introduced addressing racial violence by police. Training programs shifted, oversight committees expanded. Cynics called it cosmetic, but Evelyn knew even small cracks in the wall mattered. Walls eventually fall, but only if someone dares to strike them first. At home, away from cameras and speeches, life returned to something resembling ordinary. They shared dinners, laughed at old sitcoms, argued over chores. Yet beneath it all ran a current of unspoken knowledge. They had survived something most families would never imagine. That survival bound them tighter than blood alone ever could. On a quiet evening, golden light spilling across the living room, Maya asked the question she had been circling for months. Mom, do you think it will ever stop? The hate. Evelyn set down her cup of tea, meeting her daughter's gaze with the weight of years. Hate doesn't stop on its own, she said softly. But it can be outlived. It can be outshone. And every time you stand, every time you speak, You make sure of that. Maya nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Then I'll keep standing. And Evelyn knew she would. The city would move on, headlines would fade, but in living rooms and classrooms, in whispered prayers and loud protests, Maya's story would linger. It would live in the courage of those who came after her, in the laws rewritten, in the silence broken. Acid had scarred her skin, but it had not touched her spirit. That spirit now belonged not just to her, but to a world desperate for proof that even in the face of hatred, humanity could endure. In the end, Evelyn and Maya walked together through the courthouse steps once more, the golden sun stretching across their path. Cameras clicked, chants rose, but neither paused. They walked side by side, mother and daughter, judge and survivor, shadows behind them, light before them. And as the crowd roared, the truth settled like sunlight on their shoulders. Hatred had tried to define them, but love and justice had the final word. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.